Welcome to the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast, presented by the Beef Cattle Research Council, the most popular content from beefresearch.ca, available on the go. Before we get into this week's episode, a quick message from the BCRC. The objective of harvesting any type of forage for storage is to preserve feed resources at their nutritional peak in order to provide winter feed for livestock when grazing is not feasible or accessible. It is essential to harvest forage at the appropriate time based upon nutritional quality, forage yield, and weather conditions, and then to store it properly to reduce losses. Feed is the major input cost in cattle production. Therefore, producers must evaluate the cost of production for all storage forage systems. To learn more about preserving and storing forages, click the link in the show notes. This episode features the BCRC Science Director, Dr. Reynold Bergen.
Canadian Food Inspection Agency revisited their transport of animal regulations a few years ago. And among other things, the revised regulations require longer and more frequent feed, water, and rest stops during long-haul transport. Over the past couple of years, this column has summarized 3 different research trials conducted by Karen Schwarzkopf-Genswein's team at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Lethbridge Research Station. And those results repeatedly demonstrate that rest stops during long-haul transport did not provide measurable or meaningful benefits for recently weaned beef calves. In fact, new data suggests that those rest stops may actually pose a risk. During the course of those trials, they collected nasal samples and tested them for respiratory bacteria during each of those 3 trials. The first results from those analyses have just been published, and the online version of this article links to the original research paper if you want to go through it yourself. So in that trial, they took 160 freshly weaned crossbred beef calves, so these were not preconditioned. They all came from a single ranch, and they split those into 2 groups of 80 calves. One group of 80 calves went to an auction mart overnight with feed and water, and then the next day they were put through the ring before they were loaded onto a truck to ship to the research feedlot. The other 80 calves were ranch direct, so they went straight to the feedlot without going through the auction mart. Now, commercial truckers loaded the calves at either the auction mart or the ranch, and then they hauled them for 36 hours and then unloaded them. And at that point, half of the auction mart and half of the ranch direct calves were immediately reloaded again and hauled for another 4 hours to the research lot. The other half of each subgroup were rested for 8 hours, then reloaded and hauled the last 4 hours to the research feedlot. Now, they collected deep nasopharyngeal swabs from 48 calves, so 12 from each of those 4 groups. They collected those when they unloaded them at the research feedlot, as well as 1 day, 3 days, 6 days, and 28 days after arrival. So a deep nasopharyngeal swab is sort of like a COVID test that goes all the way up the nose to right to where it meets the throat. So it's a really deep sample. The idea is that they're trying to get an assessment of what kind of bacteria are close to the lung, deep in the respiratory tract. So anyway, they collected all these swabs, they tested them for different groups of bacteria. So they tested them for bacteria like lactobacillus, which can help protect respiratory health. And they tested them for bacteria like streptococcus that can break down protective mucus and actually impair respiratory health. And they tested those swabs for bacteria that are directly involved in bovine respiratory disease. So that's things like Histophilus and Mannheimia and Pasteurella and Mycoplasma. So what did they learn from all this? Well, when they compared the ranch direct to the auction mart calves, they learned that Mycoplasma, Pasteurella, Histophilus, Mannheimia, the ones that are most associated with BRD, those were more common in the auction mart calves than the ranch direct calves. Which isn't surprising, but it is more surprising than you might think, because those research calves, they did go to the auction mart, but they were not pre-sorted, and they were not mixed with calves from other ranches at the auction mart. So at best, those research calves shared a fence line or a water bowl with other calves. So it was actually a bit more like a rest stop than it was an auction mart experience. So that was a bit concerning. Now, when they compared the rested to the unrested calves, they found out that the auction mart calves that were unloaded for a rest carried fewer protective lactobacillus than unrested auction mart calves at each of those sampling time points. So, 0 or 1, 3, 6, and 28 days after arrival. Similarly, the rested ranch direct calves carried less lactobacillus than the unrested ranch direct calves 28 days after they'd arrived at the feedlot. So those are not promising results. Those suggest that resting reduced the numbers of protective bacteria. Now, in terms of the streptococcus bacteria, the ones that can impair respiratory health, they were much more common in rested auction mart calves than in unrested auction mart calves at 4 out of the 5 different sampling time points. And rested ranch direct calves also carried more streptococcus than unrested ranch direct calves at every sampling time, and that's not good either. So far we've got fewer protective bacteria and we've got more potentially harmful bacteria in the rested groups. So they looked at the BRD-associated bacteria, and they found out that rest stops also increased the abundance of those BRD bacteria. So rested auction mart calves carried more mycoplasma than the unrested auction mart calves at 4 of the 5 sampling times. The rested ranch direct calves carried slightly fewer mycoplasma than the unrested ranch direct calves at all 5 time points. Rested auction mart calves carried slightly fewer Pasteurella than the unrested auction mart calves at all 5 time points, but rested ranch direct calves carried slightly more Pasteurella than the unrested ranch direct calves every time. And rested auction mart calves carried more Histophilus than unrested auction mart calves on day 1, 3, and 6 after feedlot arrival. And rested ranch direct calves carried more Histophilus than unrested ranch direct calves on day 3 after arrival. Rested auction mart calves carried more Mannheimia than unrested auction mart calves the day after arrival, while rested ranch direct calves carried more Mannheimia than unrested ranch direct calves at all 5 measurement points. So it's a bit of a mixed bag with the BRD bacteria, but overall, rest stops seem to tilt the BRD bacteria in the wrong direction. The rested calves tended to have more BRD bacteria than the unrested ones. So what does this mean to you? Well, only 6% of the calves ended up getting treated for BRD. So that's too low to detect statistically meaningful differences in treatment rates between the groups. But the microbiology suggests that a rest stop during long-distance transport may increase the risk of BRD in newly weaned beef calves. An 8-hour rest stop reduced the numbers of good protective bacteria and increased the numbers of bacteria that can compromise respiratory health and or cause BRD. So the bottom line is that Canadian research had already shown that rest stops during long-haul transport don't benefit newly weaned beef calves. And this new research suggests that rest stops may increase the risk of BRD. That could potentially increase the need for preventative or therapeutic antibiotic use, though again, this study was too small to detect those differences. But we'll bring you the results from those other 2 trials as they become available as well.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. You can find all relevant links and information at beefresearch.ca or in the show notes. The Beef Cattle Research Council is funded by the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff and strives for excellence in the production of Canadian beef, cattle, and forage through research, innovation, and extension. Tune in every Tuesday as the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast delivers straightforward insights, expert information, and a wealth of practical knowledge for Canadian beef producers. Subscribe now.